The death of an emperor's wife in ancient Rome was more than personal tragedy. It was a seismic event that rippled through the highest echelons of power, unsettling the fragile balance of imperial authority. The emperor at the center of this chapter was consumed by his grief, yet his mourning quickly warped into a disturbing obsession that would echo through history as a testament to human desperation and cruelty. This emperor's wife had been a figure of beauty and influence, revered not only for her status but for her subtle sway over political decisions and court alliances. Her sudden death left the emperor unmoored, shattering the semblance of control that masked his vulnerabilities. In the culture of Rome, where emperors were expected to embody divine favor and absolute power, such personal loss was a dangerous fissure in the facade. Unable to accept the permanence of death, the emperor turned inward, fixating on a dark and unprecedented desire to replace the woman he had lost. This was not a matter of finding a new bride, but of attempting to preserve her essence in a living form. Historical records reveal that he selected a young slave boy from the imperial household, a child of no political significance, but one whose body and features could be altered. The transformation sought was brutal and irreversible. Ancient Roman medical practices, primitive yet advanced enough to perform mutilations and alterations, were harnessed to attempt to mold this boy into a human facsimile of the deceased empress. The boy's identity was erased systematically. His hair was shaved and dyed to match the woman's iconic locks. His voice was trained through harsh repetition, as court physicians and tutors forced him into mimicking the tone and mannerisms of the late empress. Most disturbingly, the emperor sanctioned physical mutilations to alter the boy's body, removing or reshaping genitalia and adjusting facial features. These procedures were not surgical interventions performed with modern understanding of anatomy or anesthesia, but were carried out with crude tools and excruciating cruelty. The boy's screams, recorded in fragmented text by palace scribes, attest to the unimaginable pain endured. Such acts reflected a cultural paradox in Rome, where slaves were considered property but also vessels to carry out the will of their masters without question. This particular transformation was enabled by the emperor's absolute power and the silence imposed on the imperial court. No dissent was tolerated, and the boy's existence became a secret shadow within the palace, a living monument to obsession. The court itself was a tangled web of intrigue and fear. Many courtiers saw the emperor's fixation as weakness, yet no one dared confront it openly. Instead, they became complicit either out of loyalty or self-preservation. Some viewed the boy as a grotesque symbol of the emperor's decline, others as a tool to manipulate the ruler's fragile psyche for their gain. Behind this tragic tableau lay deeper political consequences. The emperor's obsession diverted attention and resources from governing an empire already strained by internal dissent and external threats. The image of a ruler incapable of mourning with dignity undermined his legitimacy. Rumors spread beyond the palace walls, whispered among senators and soldiers alike, eroding the emperor's standing. Beyond politics, the boy's fate was emblematic of the brutal dehumanization ingrained in ancient power structures. He was denied not only his childhood but his very humanity, forced to exist as a simulacrum of a lost woman. This transformation erased his identity, subjected him to pain and psychological torment that have echoed through the surviving historical accounts as a cautionary tale about the depths of imperial madness. The emperor's obsession culminated in public appearances where the boy was presented as a living memorial. The grotesque spectacle unsettled Roman citizens who caught glimpses or heard of this unnatural replacement. It challenged the boundaries of social norms and forced a confrontation with the horrifying extremes of power wielded without restraint or empathy. Yet, beneath the surface of this chilling story lies a universal human tragedy, a man broken by loss, willing to sacrifice innocence and morality to stave off grief. The emperor's actions were born from desperation, but they unleashed a cycle of cruelty that would stain his reign and haunt the annals of history. By the end of this chapter, the boy's existence had become a whispered secret, a dark reflection of the empire's fragility. His mutilated body and coerced silence stood as testimony to the price of unchecked grief entwined with absolute power. The emperor's fragile mind, once a seat of strength, had become a prison of obsession, one that would only deepen as the empire itself began to unravel. The legacy of this horrific transformation was not merely the physical destruction of a child, but the moral decay it symbolized, the extent to which a ruler could violate the most basic human dignity in pursuit of impossible desires. The emperor's obsession had forged a monster from grief, one whose shadow stretched long beyond the walls of the palace. Touching the fate of Rome itself, the story begins far from the marble pillars of Rome's imperial palace, in a remote province conquered and subdued by the relentless expansion of the empire. It was from this distant land, marked by unfamiliar tongues and customs, that the boy was taken. His origins mattered little to those who saw him only as property, a vessel to be shaped and broken to suit imperial desires. Slave raids and forced conscriptions were common tools in Rome's arsenal of conquest. Entire villages could be stripped of their young and able-bodied, their fates sealed by imperial decree. The boy's capture was part of this systematic destruction of lives and cultures, an erasure of identity to feed the insatiable appetite of power. Upon arrival in Rome, the boy's life was marked by immediate loss and violence. He was stripped of his native clothes, language, and family ties. Immersed in a cold and alien world, his only value was as an object to be shaped according to the will of his new master, the emperor. His existence, once filled with the ordinary rhythms of childhood, was reduced to a state of abject submission and fear. The castration itself was a ritual of absolute control, a horrifying practice designed to sever not just the boy's physical ability to reproduce, but to erase any semblance of autonomy or defiance. In the ancient world, castration was a weapon of power, employed to create eunuchs who served as loyal guards, servants, or symbols of imperial dominance. It was a practice shrouded in cruelty and silence. This boy's castration was conducted without anesthesia, without mercy, in the bowels of the imperial palace, under the watchful eyes of court physicians and the emperor's trusted attendants. Historical medical texts and palace records reveal the instruments used: crude knives and sharpened blades, designed for swift but excruciating mutilation. The procedure was brutal, performed with little regard for pain or suffering. The boy's screams, though unrecorded in direct testimony, are echoed in the cold administrative notes of those tasked with ensuring the emperor's will was fulfilled. The psychological torment accompanying the physical mutilation was as profound as the pain itself. Stripped of his future, the boy became an object of property, a living reminder of the emperor's absolute authority. In Rome's imperial society, eunuchs occupied a paradoxical position. They were both feared and necessary, symbols of imperial control and tools of political maneuvering. The boy's transformation was part of this grim tradition, but with an additional layer of personal obsession from the emperor, making his fate uniquely tragic. The broader cultural context reveals how castration was entwined with concepts of power, purity, and control. Eunuchs were trusted to serve within the emperor's intimate circle precisely because their mutilation was believed to render them harmless and wholly dependent. This act removed the threat of rebellion tied to masculine sexuality or lineage claims, reinforcing the emperor's dominance. Yet beneath these calculated motives lay the human cost: irreversible bodily mutilation inflicted upon a child whose consent and understanding were meaningless. The boy's identity was obliterated, replaced by a constructed persona intended to serve the emperor's grief and political needs. This transformation was not merely physical, but a deep psychological shattering. Court officials documented the boy's condition with clinical detachment, noting the successful completion of the castration and the boy's subsequent confinement to quarters designated for eunuchs. These chambers were isolated spaces within the palace, reinforcing his exclusion from both the world he came from and the one he was forced into. The boy's life after castration was marked by isolation and surveillance. His every movement and utterance were controlled, his role redefined from human to symbol, a living emblem of imperial power and obsession. He was trained relentlessly, his body and mind molded to erase the past and embody the emperor's lost wife in a distorted echo. The physical mutilation was only the beginning. The psychological effects endured throughout the boy's life as he was subjected to constant reminders of his new status, ostracism from other slaves, scorn from courtiers, and the ever-present knowledge that he had been reduced to a tool. This was a punishment without crime, a cruelty born of power, not just. This chapter exposes the brutal reality behind the imperial facsimile, a world where human suffering was a currency exchanged for political stability and personal desire. The boy's castration was a ritual of domination, a deliberate assertion of control that transcended mere punishment and entered the realm of dehumanization. Such practices, sanctioned by imperial will, reflect the darker side of ancient power structures. They reveal how the body became a battleground where identity, agency, and humanity were sacrificed for the ambitions of rulers. The emperor's decision to castrate the boy was not an aberration, but part of a broader system that tolerated and institutionalized violence. The trauma inflicted upon the boy extended beyond the moment of mutilation. His transformation into a eunuch erased any possibility of a normal life, subjecting him to a future defined by servitude, isolation, and exploitation. This was a fate shared by countless others, though the emperor's personal obsession gave it a uniquely sinister dimension. At the heart of this brutal history is the chilling realization that empire was maintained not only through conquest, but through calculated acts of cruelty that silenced and reshaped human lives. The boy's castration was a deliberate erasure, a violent reminder that in Rome's imperial machine, some bodies were expendable, and some souls were broken to preserve the illusion of power. The imperial court was a crucible of power, intrigue, and unspoken terror. Within its gilded walls, the emperor's decrees were absolute, but beneath the surface lay a complex web of deception that sustained his darkest obsessions. The boy, transformed by mutilation and coercion, was a living secret, an embodiment of a ruler's fractured mind and the court's complicity in cruelty. Courtiers operated in a world where words could be weapons and silence a survival strategy. The court's elite were bound by fear, ambition, and the necessity to maintain the emperor's fragile image of invincibility. Open dissent was unthinkable. The consequences for those who questioned or opposed the emperor's desires were severe, ranging from exile to death. The boy's existence was officially denied. No mention was made in public records, no acknowledgement allowed in conversation. To speak of him was to threaten the delicate balance of power and risk, invoking the emperor's wrath. Yet, in whispered corners and behind closed doors, his presence was a source of dread and fascination. This culture of silence was enforced through a combination of intimidation, surveillance, and political manipulation. Trusted spies and informants ensured that rumors did not escape the palace, while courtiers learned to navigate the dangerous line between loyalty and self-preservation. Fear permeated every interaction, muting conscience and enabling atrocities to remain hidden. The boy's transformation was not only a personal tragedy, but a symbol within the court, a grotesque reminder of the emperor's vulnerability and obsession. Some courtiers used his fate as leverage, aligning themselves with factions that sought to influence the emperor's unstable decisions. Others saw the boy as a dark omen, a sign of the empire's moral decay. The palace hierarchy enforced strict control over the boy's movements and interactions. Eunuchs, already marginalized within society, occupied an ambiguous space, trusted yet isolated, visible yet invisible. This paradox reflected the court's contradictory nature, a stage for grand display and a vault of secrets where human suffering was concealed. The emperor's obsession became a tool wielded by power brokers within the court. By exploiting the ruler's fragile mental state, they manipulated decisions, steering policies and appointments to suit their ambitions. The boy's forced presence was thus intertwined with political machinations, amplifying the corruption that plagued the imperial administration. Despite this, there were moments of quiet unease among the courtiers. Some recognized the moral abyss into which the court had descended, but felt powerless to act. Their silence was not born of agreement but of survival, a grim acknowledgement that the machinery of empire tolerated no challenge to its darkest impulses. This environment of fear and deception extended beyond the palace walls. Senators, military leaders, and provincial governors received carefully curated versions of events, shielded from the truth of the emperor's obsession and the boy's mutilation. The public facade remained intact, masking the rot within. The consequences of this enforced silence were profound. By suppressing truth and compassion, the court enabled the continuation of abuses that eroded the empire's ethical foundation. The boy's suffering became a footnote erased from official history, a casualty sacrificed to preserve illusion and power. In this way, cruelty was institutionalized, normalized by layers of denial and complicity. The emperor's fantasy, born of grief, was sustained by a court that chose fear over justice, silence over truth. The mechanisms of oppression operated smoothly, ensuring that the darkest acts remained hidden and unchallenged. The boy's existence, though hidden, was a constant specter haunting the court. His mutilated body and coerced silence underscored the human cost of absolute power left unchecked. The court's role in this tragedy was not passive but active, a participant in the cycle of violence and denial. This chapter reveals how political expediency and personal ambition converged to protect a secret that should have shattered the empire's moral core. It exposes a culture where cruelty was tolerated as a necessary evil, a price paid to maintain the illusion of order and strength. The emperor's court was thus a realm of shadows, where truth was sacrificed and human dignity was trampled beneath the wheels of power. The boy's fate was not an anomaly, but a symptom of a system that privileged control over conscience, deception over justice. The process of transformation was neither subtle nor humane. It was a calculated and merciless campaign to obliterate the boy's past and reforge him into a living simulacrum of the emperor's deceased wife. This was not merely physical alteration, but an orchestrated assault on identity, dignity, and autonomy. The boy was subjected to a series of brutal rituals and forced feminization procedures designed to strip away all traces of his former self. In the ancient imperial palace, these transformations were carried out by a cadre of court physicians, priests, and attendants who served both medical and ritualistic roles. Their work combined the rudimentary practices of surgery with symbolic ceremonies meant to sever the boy's past and invoke the presence of the empress in his altered form. What followed was a ritualized mutilation, underscored by psychological domination. The initial stage involved cleansing rites drawn from Roman and imported pagan traditions, intended to purify the boy's body and spirit. These ceremonies were less about healing than about exerting control, a forced baptism into a new, imposed identity. The boy was stripped, anointed with oils, and dressed in the empress's discarded silks, fabrics heavy with history and loss. Physically, the alterations were extensive and excruciating. The boy's body was reshaped through repeated and cruel interventions. His facial features were altered by cauterization and binding, the contours of his jaw and nose compressed or scarred to approximate the empress's likeness. His hair, dyed with costly pigments, was styled to replicate the distinctive coiffure of the lost wife, a visible marker of his new identity. The transformation extended to his voice, trained relentlessly by tutors and court eunuchs who forced him to mimic the empress's mannerisms and speech patterns. Any deviation was punished severely, reinforcing that resistance was futile. Psychological coercion accompanied physical change, a constant reminder that his own identity was now a crime against the emperor's will. Most harrowing were the forced feminization treatments applied to the boy's body. Without anesthesia or modern understanding, court physicians administered a series of potions, ointments, and rudimentary hormone-like concoctions intended to soften his features and suppress masculine traits. These treatments were experimental, painful, and unpredictable, compounding the boy's suffering. In tandem with these bodily alterations, ritual ceremonies invoked the presence of the empress's spirit. Priests performed sacrifices and recitations aimed at binding the boy's soul to the memory of the deceased, attempting to erase his original self and replace it with a spectral echo. These rituals blurred lines between religion and cruelty, turning the boy into a vessel of mourning and obsession. The boy's psychological torment was relentless. Stripped of his name and heritage, forced to embody a woman he never was, he existed in a liminal state, neither fully boy nor woman, neither living nor free. Historical accounts describe the depth of his despair, though always filtered through the detached voices of scribes and officials who failed or refused to grasp the human cost. Isolation was a constant companion. The boy was confined within the palace's inner chambers, hidden from public view except when summoned by the emperor. His interactions were limited to a select few, attendants and tutors who enforced his transformation with cold efficiency. This seclusion reinforced his role as an object rather than a person, a symbol of loss made grotesque by obsession. The emperor's desire for control extended to every aspect of the boy's existence. He was monitored, disciplined, and molded according to a script dictated by grief and power. The court's complicity ensured that this transformation continued unchecked, their silence and obedience sustaining a cycle of cruelty cloaked in ritual. Despite the physical and psychological violence, the transformation was incomplete and unnatural. The boy's body bore scars and imperfections, signs of a forced metamorphosis that could never fully erase his origins. This tension between the boy's past and the imposed identity created a profound dissonance, a fractured existence caught between two worlds. The cultural implications of this forced feminization reveal a grim aspect of imperial authority. The emperor's obsession twisted not only a child's body, but the very meanings of gender, identity, and power within Roman society. To the court, the boy was no longer a human being but a macabre symbol, a distorted tribute to grief and desperation. The rituals and treatments that comprised the transformation served a dual purpose: to satisfy the emperor's obsessive desire to resurrect the empress's presence, and to enforce a narrative of absolute control. Through this process, the emperor sought to defy death itself, attempting to hold onto a past that could never return. Yet this desperate attempt revealed the fragility beneath imperial grandeur. The boy's forced metamorphosis was a grotesque spectacle of loss and control, exposing how grief could warp reason and ethics alike. The tragedy was not only in the boy's mutilated body, but in the empire's willingness to sacrifice innocence and humanity for illusion. This chapter lays bare the harrowing intersection of power, obsession, and identity. It reveals how imperial ambition, cloaked in ritual and medicine, can become a machine of erasure, devouring the vulnerable to sustain the delusions of the mighty. The boy's transformation into a living echo of the empress brought him into the heart of imperial life, but cast him into a prison from which there was no escape. His new role granted him privileges unknown to most slaves: access to the emperor's private chambers, finely woven garments, and a semblance of status. Yet these external trappings masked a deeper, inescapable imprisonment. Within the palace's marble corridors and richly adorned halls, the boy moved under ceaseless scrutiny. Every gesture, every word was monitored by courtiers and eunuchs alike, ensuring strict adherence to the role imposed upon him. His existence was meticulously controlled, his freedom curtailed by layers of guards and watchers who saw him less as a person and more as a fragile possession. The emperor's volatile moods shaped the boy's daily reality. At times, the ruler's grief softened into moments of tenderness or fixation. When the boy was summoned to play the part of the lost wife, reciting favored poems, adopting her posture, or simply sitting silently beside the emperor, these instances were fraught with tension, a mixture of reverence and despair that underscored the emperor's fractured psyche. Yet this fragile acceptance could shatter without warning. The emperor's anger, often a reflection of his internal torment, could erupt violently, directed at the boy as both scapegoat and symbol. Punishments were meted out for the smallest perceived failures: a faltering voice, a hesitant glance, or a gesture deemed unworthy of the empress's memory. Such punishments were not only physical but psychological, reinforcing the boy's total dependence and isolation. Outside the emperor's immediate presence, the boy faced a far harsher reality. Courtiers who outwardly demonstrated loyalty privately harbored disdain or pity, viewing him as a monstrous perversion of nature and power. His status was ambiguous, too privileged to be free, yet too altered to be fully accepted. This liminal existence deepened his isolation, as he was shunned by both slaves and nobles alike. The palace itself became a cage, its opulence a stark contrast to the boy's internal desolation. Isolated in chambers near the emperor's quarters, he was surrounded by luxury, but starved of human connection. The attendants assigned to him were vigilant but distant, trained to enforce his role without empathy. His movements were regimented, his interactions scripted, all designed to erase his autonomy. Surveillance extended beyond mere observation. The palace was rife with informants, eunuchs and servants who reported any deviation from expected behavior. The boy's private moments, rare though they were infiltrated by this ever-present gaze. Such constant monitoring ensured that rebellion or escape were impossible, embedding a permanent sense of captivity. The psychological toll of this existence was profound. Stripped of personal identity, forced to embody a ghost of another, the boy's mind became a battleground of despair and dissociation. Historical records hint at episodes of withdrawal, moments when he retreated into silence, overwhelmed by the impossibility of his condition. These were not seen as cries for help, but as weaknesses to be corrected. The emperor's own instability exacerbated this torment. His unpredictable affections and brutal reprimands created a volatile environment where the boy's survival depended on constant vigilance and subservience. The boy's fear was not only of physical harm, but of emotional annihilation, the erasure of any flicker of self beneath the emperor's obsessive demands. Yet, paradoxically, the boy's presence was essential to the court's ritual of power. As a living symbol of the emperor's grief and authority, he embodied both vulnerability and control. His transformation was a grotesque spectacle, a reminder to courtiers and subjects alike of the emperor's dominion over life and death, love and loss. This duality, privilege intertwined with imprisonment, defined the boy's existence. The palace was a stage where he performed an endless role, while behind the scenes he was a captive of grief and cruelty. His life was a paradox, revered yet reviled, visible yet invisible, honored yet utterly alone. The isolation was compounded by the knowledge that his fate was irrevocable. Escape was unthinkable. The empire's reach was vast, and the boy's mutilated body marked him permanently. He was bound not only by physical constraints, but by the weight of a legacy he never chose, a living relic of obsession and pain. The emperor's court continued its carefully orchestrated charade, concealing the boy's true condition from the wider world. To outsiders, he was an enigmatic figure, a curiosity whispered about but never truly understood. Within the palace, his haunted presence served as a constant reminder of the emperor's fragility and the price paid for unrestrained power. This chapter exposes the crushing loneliness that defined the boy's life within the imperial palace. It reveals how privilege, when twisted by obsession and control, can become the harshest of prisons. The boy was not merely a servant or slave. He was a living embodiment of grief's darkest consequences. The imperial court was a place where power shifted like sand beneath the feet of those who sought to grasp it. The boy, elevated beyond his years, found himself ensnared in a labyrinth of intrigue and treachery. The emperor's favor, once a shield, now marked him as a target among the emperor's closest advisors and family. The court was no sanctuary. It was a battlefield where alliances crumbled beneath whispered accusations and conspiracies brewed behind gilded doors. Jealousy was perhaps the deadliest weapon wielded in this court. Men and women, once united in purpose, turned on one another in the hope of securing their own survival or advancement. Fear fueled their actions, fear of losing status, influence, or life itself. In such a volatile environment, the boy's presence was a threat to many who had long enjoyed unchallenged authority. His elevation disturbed the fragile hierarchy, and those who had grown complacent now found themselves scrambling to maintain their grasp on power. This poison seeped through every chamber and corridor. Trusted allies became secret enemies, their smiles masking knives sharpened for betrayal. Courtiers whispered of plots to undermine the boy's standing, to sever his connection to the emperor, and to discredit those who supported him. Some conspired openly, while others moved in shadows, arranging betrayals that would fracture the court's unity and send ripples of chaos throughout the empire. The emperor himself was not immune to this atmosphere of suspicion. His moods, already volatile, grew darker as paranoia took root. Trusted advisors were executed or exiled on mere suspicion, their fall serving as grim reminders that no one was safe. The boy's position became ever more precarious as the emperor's distrust extended even to those closest to him. Every favor granted was accompanied by a risk, every smile potentially hiding a dagger. Political maneuvering became lethal. Factions formed around different visions for the empire's future, each seeking to control the boy as a symbol of legitimacy. His youth and inexperience made him malleable, a tool to be wielded against rivals. The boy was stripped of autonomy, forced into compliance with plans drawn up by those who saw him only as a means to an end. His personal fate was eclipsed by the cold calculus of power. The court's betrayals were not limited to words or plans. Violence was a constant threat. Assassination attempts, both subtle and brutal, were whispered of in hushed tones. Poison was a favored method, silent and invisible, claiming lives without fanfare. Others met more public ends, serving as examples of the emperor's wrath and the peril of falling from favor. These brutal consequences reinforced the culture of fear and control that pervaded the palace. Amidst this storm of duplicity, the boy's innocence eroded. The bright promise once seen in his eyes was replaced by the wary resignation of one who understood too soon the cruelty of human ambition. His every action was scrutinized, his every word twisted by those who sought to manipulate his image. He became isolated, surrounded by enemies disguised as friends, his trust shattered by betrayal after betrayal. Yet, despite the treachery, some fragments of loyalty remained. A few courtiers risked everything to protect the boy, acting in secret to shield him from harm. Their efforts were desperate and often futile against the overwhelming tide of political violence. These moments of fragile loyalty only served to highlight the vastness of the boy's vulnerability within the court's ruthless hierarchy. The boy's fate was intertwined with the empire's fragile stability. Each betrayal threatened not only his life but the very fabric of the imperial order. The emperor's reign, already strained by internal conflicts and external threats, teetered on the edge of collapse. The court's poison was not merely a matter of personal vendettas, but a symptom of a crumbling system, unable to contain its own ambition. As this chapter of history unfolded, the cost of power became brutally clear. The boy's innocence was sacrificed to a game where human life was expendable and loyalty was bought and sold like currency. Betrayal was not an anomaly but the norm, a constant, deadly force shaping the empire's destiny. In the end, the boy was both victim and instrument of this deadly dance. His story reveals how the quest for power can destroy not only individuals but entire civilizations. The imperial court's betrayals left scars that would endure long after the emperor's reign ended, a haunting reminder of the darkness that can lurk within the pursuit of absolute control. The emperor's descent into madness marked a turning point not only for the boy, but for the empire itself. Once revered as a commanding figure of authority and wisdom, the emperor's mental faculties deteriorated under the relentless pressures of rule, betrayal, and isolation. His psyche fractured, giving rise to a brutal and erratic reign marked by cruelty that defied previous limits. The palace, already a place of tension and treachery, transformed into a theater of unpredictable violence and fear, where no one, not even the boy, could predict their fate. Historical records suggest the emperor suffered from what modern psychology might recognize as paranoid psychosis. His fears were no longer grounded in reality, but magnified by delusions that enemies lurked in every shadow, waiting to seize power. The emperor believed conspiracies were woven against him by those closest to him, including trusted advisors, family members, and notably, the boy who had once been the object of his favor. This delusion led to a deadly cycle of suspicion and punishment. The boy, caught in the eye of this storm, became a living symbol of the emperor's fractured mind. What had begun as political rivalry and court intrigue evolved into a personal vendetta fueled by irrational fears. The emperor's treatment of the boy oscillated wildly, from moments of unsettling tenderness to sudden and unprovoked cruelty. Such unpredictability bred terror within the court, eroding the last vestiges of order and decorum. The psychological decay of the emperor manifested in acts that shocked even the hardened courtiers. Public punishments, once reserved for perceived traitors, grew more savage and arbitrary. The emperor's decrees reflected a mind unraveling. Edicts were issued without logic, targeting innocents and enemies alike. The boy was subjected to harsh isolation, physical punishments, and humiliations meant not only to discipline, but to break his spirit completely. This cruelty was justified by the emperor's belief that such measures were necessary to root out the imagined threats encircling his throne. This era also saw the rise of new rituals of control within the palace walls, brutal punishments designed to enforce obedience through fear. Some courtiers were forced to witness the boy's suffering, a grotesque demonstration of the emperor's power and the depths of his madness. The atmosphere thickened with dread as whispers spread of plots that existed only in the emperor's fractured mind, leading to arrests and executions based on fabricated charges. The emperor's delusions extended beyond the boy. He perceived the empire itself as fragile and riddled with enemies who sought to dismantle his rule. His actions grew increasingly reckless. Wars were declared against imagined foes, resources diverted to futile campaigns, and alliances shattered by paranoia. This eroded the empire's stability, weakening its foundations at a time when strength was desperately needed. Court documents and contemporary accounts describe the emperor's mood swings, oscillating between manic bursts of energy and crushing episodes of despair. These shifts disrupted governance as ministers struggled to anticipate the emperor's next decree or outburst. The boy's position as a potential heir or pawn became dangerously uncertain amid this chaos, as the emperor's fluctuating perceptions clouded any consistent strategy for succession. The emperor's madness was not merely a personal tragedy, but a catalyst for widespread suffering. The court's fragile hierarchy dissolved into chaos, as courtiers and generals vied for influence amid the emperor's erratic rule. Repression intensified, and paranoia spread like wildfire, infecting the entire administration. The boy's fate, entwined with this decay, was emblematic of a broader collapse, where the mechanisms of power no longer functioned to maintain order, but to perpetuate fear and destruction. This mental collapse had deeper roots than mere stress or age. Some historians speculate underlying illnesses exacerbated by the emperor's isolation and growing distrust of all around him. The emperor increasingly withdrew from counsel, relying instead on distorted perceptions and violent impulses. His inability to distinguish friend from foe led to the elimination of many who had once supported him, further isolating him and accelerating his decline. The psychological torment inflicted on the boy was profound. Subjected to unpredictable punishment and neglect, he was forced into a state of constant vigilance and despair. The emperor's madness transformed the boy from a favored figure into a scapegoat for the empire's unraveling. This dehumanization stripped away any remnants of dignity or hope, leaving behind a broken individual caught in the empire's crumbling core. Despite this darkness, some chroniclers noted moments of tragic clarity in the emperor's behavior, brief flashes where the man beneath the madness seemed to resurface. These glimpses, however fleeting, only deepened the horror of his decline. The contrast between past glory and present ruin underscored the catastrophic cost of unchecked power fused with mental collapse. As the empire teetered on the edge of disintegration, the emperor's madness sealed its fate. His inability to govern rationally opened the door to internal revolts, external invasions, and the eventual downfall of a dynasty once thought invincible. The boy's suffering was a microcosm of this larger tragedy, a human cost buried beneath the weight of political and psychological ruin. Despite the overwhelming atmosphere of fear and repression that gripped the imperial court, resistance quietly took root among a small number of courtiers, servants, and advisors. These individuals recognized the catastrophic consequences of the emperor's madness and the boy's suffering. Bound by a shared sense of justice and humanity, they chose to defy the crushing weight of tyranny, risking everything in a perilous struggle that could cost them their lives. The origins of this secret resistance were humble. It began with whispered conversations in hidden chambers and clandestine meetings under the cover of night. These acts of defiance were born not from grand political ambitions but from simple, urgent necessity to protect the boy from further harm and to preserve some semblance of morality within the palace's corrupt walls. In an environment where trust was a luxury few could afford, the members of this group carefully concealed their true intentions behind outward loyalty. Their strategy relied on secrecy and subtlety. Direct confrontation with the emperor or his loyalists was impossible, the risks were too high, and the emperor's paranoia made detection almost certain death. Instead, the resistance worked through covert channels, smuggling messages, sabotaging orders for cruel punishments, and quietly gathering evidence of the emperor's increasingly erratic and violent behavior. These efforts were painstaking and slow, but each small act of defiance was a critical thread in a fragile tapestry of hope. The boy became the focus of their protection. His survival was not only a matter of personal loyalty, but also symbolized resistance against the emperor's despotic reign. The group arranged secret provisions, hidden safe spaces, and subtle interventions to mitigate the harsh punishments inflicted upon him. Their commitment was fierce, forged by a profound recognition of the boy's innocence amid a landscape of betrayal and madness. This resistance also served as a channel for exposing the emperor's crimes beyond the palace. Trusted courtiers risked smuggling documents and testimonies to sympathetic nobles and foreign envoys, seeking to build awareness and support for intervention. These acts were fraught with danger. Any hint of betrayal could trigger brutal reprisals, but they represented a desperate attempt to hold the emperor accountable. However faint the hope of success, the cultural context of the time complicated these efforts. Loyalty to the emperor was enshrined not only in law, but in deeply ingrained social and religious norms. To resist was to challenge the very foundation of the empire's order. The secret allies understood that their defiance was seen as treason, punishable by death and infamy. Yet they persisted, driven by a moral imperative that transcended fear. The palace itself became a silent battleground. Every corridor, every chamber, was layered with suspicion and covert operations. The resistance had to navigate a complex web of informants, spies, and loyalists eager to betray them for personal gain. This heightened tension created an atmosphere thick with paranoia, where even the smallest misstep could unravel their efforts and doom them all. Historical records suggest the resistance's actions had limited but significant impact. They delayed the emperor's most violent impulses and shielded the boy from immediate death on several occasions. Their courage inspired quiet hope among those suffering in the palace and beyond. Though unable to overthrow the emperor directly, their perseverance planted seeds of dissent that would later fuel larger uprisings. This fragile hope was a beacon in the darkness of the empire's collapse. It illuminated the capacity for human compassion and bravery in the face of overwhelming evil. The resistance's story stands as a powerful reminder that even within the most oppressive regimes, small acts of courage can challenge tyranny and preserve humanity. Yet, the cost of resistance was high. Members of the group were discovered and executed in brutal displays meant to deter others. Their deaths were a grim testament to the stakes involved. Despite these losses, their sacrifices were not in vain, as their actions contributed to the eventual unraveling of the emperor's reign and the preservation of the boy's legacy. The secret resistance reveals a hidden dimension of this tragic history, a dimension often overshadowed by the overwhelming cruelty and madness of the time. It speaks to the enduring human spirit that refuses to yield completely to darkness, even when surrounded by despair and hopelessness. The empire's decay, long masked by fear and manipulation, finally reached a breaking point. The forces that had sustained the emperor's rule, the court's obedience, the military's loyalty, and the population's resignation, fractured under the strain of relentless cruelty, famine, and political instability. Beneath the surface, simmering unrest erupted into open rebellion, fueled by the very horrors that had once been hidden behind the palace's walls. The rebellion was both spontaneous and orchestrated, a volatile mixture of desperate peasants, disgruntled nobles, and soldiers disillusioned by the emperor's erratic commands. The emperor's madness had alienated many, turning once loyal factions into adversaries. The resistance that had long operated in secrecy emerged as a crucial force, providing coordination and intelligence to those seeking to end the tyrannical reign. Battles raged across the empire, devastating cities and countryside alike. The emperor's forces, plagued by infighting and waning morale, could no longer maintain control. His orders became increasingly disconnected from reality, reflecting his fractured mental state rather than strategic necessity. As the rebellion gained momentum, the palace became a fortress under siege, both physically and symbolically representing the dying heart of an empire. Within this chaos, the boy's fate remained uncertain. Once the favored pawn of the emperor, he was now a symbol of the regime's failures and the hope for a new order. The boy, scarred by years of psychological and physical torment, emerged from the shadows of captivity into a world irrevocably changed. His survival was itself a testament to the resilience of human endurance, but his liberation was far from a simple triumph. Historical accounts reveal the boy's complex position during the downfall. His release came not through mercy, but as a strategic decision by rebels aiming to delegitimize the emperor's authority. Some factions viewed the boy as a potential leader, a living link to the empire's past, and a figure around whom the shattered society might rally. Others, however, feared his associations with the fallen regime and the trauma that had marked him. The boy's liberation was accompanied by a public spectacle designed to symbolize the end of tyranny. Yet, this exposure also subjected him to the scrutiny of a population eager for justice and retribution. The line between victim and symbol blurred, and the boy found himself caught in the middle of conflicting narratives. His trauma was visible but poorly understood, his silence often mistaken for complicity or weakness. The psychological scars borne by the boy were deep and enduring. Years of isolation, abuse, and manipulation had left him emotionally fractured. Survivors' testimonies and medical writings of the time describe symptoms consistent with what modern psychiatry would identify as post-traumatic stress disorder. Nightmares, paranoia, and social withdrawal marked his recovery, underscoring the high cost of survival under tyranny. Political instability persisted even after the emperor's fall. The power vacuum triggered struggles among various factions vying to shape the empire's future. The boy's ambiguous status complicated these efforts. While some sought to protect him as a symbol of continuity and stability, others viewed him as a dangerous reminder of a brutal past that must be purged entirely. The boy's personal fate became a subject of debate among the new rulers. Some historical sources suggest he was placed under the guardianship of a noble family sympathetic to his plight, living the remainder of his life removed from politics and public view. Other accounts hint at a more tragic end: exile, imprisonment, or forced disappearance, reflecting the uncertainty and danger that continued to surround him even after the emperor's death. The collapse of the emperor's regime also exposed the empire's systemic failures, social inequality, corruption, and brutal repression that had fueled its downfall. The boy's story embodied these contradictions, a life marked by privilege and suffering, power and helplessness. His survival was a bitter reminder that liberation from tyranny does not erase the trauma inflicted by it. This chapter reveals the devastating cost of the empire's fall, not only in lives lost and cities destroyed, but in the irreversible damage inflicted on its most vulnerable. The boy's ambiguous fate is emblematic of a broader historical truth: freedom, gained through violence and upheaval, often carries its own burdens, complicating any hope for healing or justice. Despite the collapse, the legacy of the emperor's reign lingered. The trauma endured by survivors like the boy shaped the political and cultural landscape for generations to come. Stories of cruelty and resilience circulated, warning of the dangers inherent in absolute power unchecked by humanity or reason. The empire that once stood as a beacon of might and splendor now exists only in fragmented ruins and faded records. Yet, centuries after its collapse, historians have gradually peeled back layers of myth and legend to reveal a far darker reality, one where political cruelty, psychological torment, and systemic brutality were the foundation beneath imperial glory. This process of historical reckoning confronts not only the emperor's notorious madness and reign of terror, but also the countless erased voices of those who suffered in silence. For centuries, official accounts and imperial propaganda cloaked the darkest chapters in selective narratives, presenting the emperor as a powerful ruler whose reign, though harsh, was necessary to maintain order. The boy, often relegated to a footnote or dismissed as a mere curiosity, was buried beneath layers of sanitized history. It was only through painstaking archival work, cross-referencing chronicles, letters, and artifacts, that scholars began to reconstruct the grim truth behind the empire's facade. This truth exposes the human cost of absolute power wielded without restraint or conscience. The political machinations, betrayals, and madness that marked the emperor's court were not isolated incidents, but symptomatic of a broader culture of cruelty institutionalized within the empire's hierarchy. Ritualized torture, public humiliations, and forced isolation, practices once justified by ideology or superstition, are now understood as deliberate instruments of control and dehumanization. The boy's story, once obscured by the vast machinery of imperial narrative, emerges as a powerful symbol of victimhood and resilience. His experiences reflect the vulnerabilities of those caught between competing forces of power and oppression. The psychological scars he bore, now interpreted through modern understanding of trauma and mental health, challenge historical assumptions about strength, agency, and survival in oppressive systems. Historians emphasize the significance of reclaiming these erased voices. Through recovered testimonies, fragmented letters, and archaeological findings, the humanity of the empire's victims begins to surface. Their stories provide essential perspectives that complicate simplified portrayals of history as a succession of rulers and battles. Instead, they reveal the lived realities of fear, loss, and endurance endured by those trapped within the empire's brutal structures. This reckoning also raises difficult questions about memory, justice, and the legacy of violence. How should history remember rulers who combined visionary leadership with devastating cruelty? What responsibility do modern societies bear for acknowledging the suffering hidden beneath cultural achievements? The legacy of the emperor's reign forces confrontation with these uncomfortable dilemmas, illustrating how power can simultaneously create and destroy. Artifacts recovered from imperial sites, such as personal belongings, medical implements, and official decrees, offer tangible evidence of the physical and psychological torment inflicted. These objects serve as chilling reminders that behind the splendor lay calculated systems of punishment and repression. Museums and academic institutions now grapple with how to present these findings ethically, balancing education with respect for the victim's dignity. The broader cultural impact of this historical reckoning is profound. Literature, art, and scholarship increasingly reflect themes of trauma, resilience, and the complexities of power. The empire's story has become a cautionary tale, warning of the dangers inherent in unchecked authority and the fragility of human rights under autocratic rule. It challenges audiences to critically examine how history is recorded and whose narratives are preserved. Moreover, this reckoning deepens understanding of how political cruelty reverberates across generations. The psychological and social effects of the emperor's actions did not end with his death. They shaped cultural memory and identity long afterward. Communities descended from those who lived under the empire carry inherited trauma, influencing traditions, attitudes toward authority, and collective memory. The erasure of victims' voices remains a critical concern. Despite advances in historical research, many stories are lost forever, destroyed by time, censorship, or deliberate suppression. This loss underscores the importance of preserving diverse perspectives and recognizing the limits of historical knowledge. The boy's story, while partially recovered, symbolizes countless others who vanished into oblivion. Ultimately, the legacy of pain embedded in the empire's history is a stark testament to humanity's capacity for both cruelty and survival. It challenges simplistic notions of progress, revealing that the shadows of past atrocities linger beneath the surface of modern civilization. This final chapter of history calls for vigilance against repeating such horrors and for honoring those who endured them. Thanks for diving into the shadows of history with me today. Remember, the past isn't always buried quietly. Sometimes, It screams from the depths of time. Until next time, stay curious and beware what secrets lie beneath. See you in the next dark tale.